Okay, welcome to Waters Up, a podcast brought to you by the Maine Water Utilities Association and the Maine Water Environment Association, where water and wastewater operators can earn credit hours just by listening to this podcast. You are listening to episode 5 of this wildly popular series, Waters Up with PFAS and Wildlife in Fairfield. I'm your host, the self-indulgent, completely inexperienced wannabe legend in my own mind, Rob Pontos. Thanks so much for joining us. And if you've made it this far, please don't leave now. Just want to let people know that are listening, first-time listeners that are looking for credits and so forth. After the end of the podcast, we will post a link to a quiz down in the comment section on the YouTube page. It's a very simple quiz that just basically verifies that you listened to the show. So pay attention throughout the show because I'll probably give the answers away and I'll do my best to make it abundantly clear. And lastly, before we start introducing our guests, I need to take a minute to thank our sponsor for this episode. These shows wouldn't happen without a sponsor, and all the proceeds go directly back to Maine Water Utilities Association and go towards training and resources for the water industry. So I want to thank Ty Sales. Ty Sales is a leading distributor of water and wastewater supplies across all of New England and New York, and is dedicated to having the fastest service and the most knowledgeable experts in the industry. Since 1963, Ty Sales has worked with countless water utilities, contractors, consultants, and resellers to provide the highest quality products and solutions to meet their long-term needs. You can reach them at 1-800-225-4616 or on the web at tysales.com. That's tisales.com. So there we go. The screen share is off. We've got through the introduction, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce my guest for today's podcast. First, we have Tim Wade, who is the operations manager at the Greater Augusta Utilities District. He's currently the vice president for MWEA, the Maine Water Environment Association, and he's the past chair of the Government Affairs Committee. So Tim has been involved in legislation and lots of things going on with PFAS. And he also has some personal experience because Tim, like myself and Mike on the show here, we're all hunters. And Tim lives in the area and has harvested deer out of the advisory area. So he'll share some of his personal stories with us in a little bit. So Tim, can you show us how you fold your tongue into a 3-leaf clover, or is that for private parties only?
That's how we're starting this, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, it's a 2-step process. You ready?
Yeah. 1, 2. Pretty good. Pretty good. It's not a bad view.
Never thought I'd do that live on whatever this is. But.
Yeah, well, there's only like 7 people watching. 22 right now, but that number usually goes up a little afternoon, and then we'll get up into the hundreds after the live version. But and Tim's claim to fame is that you invented the tummy warmer.
Yeah, so a couple of years after college, I worked at the big flagship bar at Sugarloaf, the Widowmaker, and a lot of times I was working kind of off hours, like a Wednesday afternoon where we wouldn't be really slammed. We had some time to, try some different drinks out on buddies that would stop by, and came up with this really sweet hot chocolate drink, named it the Timmy Tummy Warmer. It's hot chocolate, Parrot Bay rum, butter shots, and amaretto.
Excellent.
And the drink ended up making it all the way to Jackson Hole a couple of years later, as some other bartenders that worked with me kind of spread the drink around. So,
okay, that's pretty impressive. So, have you been yourself tried it at any of these other bars out west, or have you just got word that it made it that far?
No, I had a table tent sent back to me with the drink list, and it was included there. I have not tried it at Jackson Hole.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope you get out there and try it sometime soon. How's that? All right. And I'm going to move on. We also have now, Tim and I have known each other for a few years, as has Mike and I, but Dr. Andy Smith on the show here. He and I just met a few in person yesterday and via email a couple weeks ago. he's one of our experts on the show. He is the state toxicologist at the Maine CDC, and he spent 6 weeks traveling to Antarctica and back. So can you tell us your favorite part of that experience?
Oh, I don't know. There were a lot of favorite parts of that experience, but I think part of it was just sort of like Tim. I was very young at the time, and was sort of my first time flying and first time really out of the country, and found myself headed to Buenos Aires, Argentina, to get on an Argentine Navy ship for a cruise. It was an oceanographic science cruise to the Antarctic Ocean. And I don't know whether it was seeing big icebergs for the first time, or getting stuck in the ice for a while, or it just was all just an incredible experience for a young person to be out there. And let alone we came into Buenos Aires when there was a little bit of sword rattling between them and Chile over the Beagle Islands. So all the military was on high alert. The ships were guarded with people with machine guns. So that was kind of a different experience as well. So.
Oh, I bet that was a little bit hectic. So how old were you at the time? In your early 20s?
Yep, 20. I was 20 years old when I went down there.
So still had a lot to learn about life, right? So.
And still do.
Yeah. Unlike me, who I knew everything when I was 12, and then when I was 18, I definitely knew everything. Right. By the time I was 22, there was nothing left to learn. But soon I realized that was never going to be the case, right? So, and then you also imprinted black ducklings and worked the summer doing some research in Maine. Can you just give me a 1-minute roundup of that?
Oh, that was again when I went back to college after stopping out for a while. I got a nice summer job on an acid rain study that was looking at how it affected black ducklings. So we obtained eggs from the help me out, Nate. Is it the National Fisheries? What's the national organization called for? So Patuxent Laboratory.
Oh, Patuxent National Wildlife Health Center.
Yeah. So the eggs came from them. And then when they hatch, they're hatched out on the floor. This is at the University of Maine Wildlife Department. And we make a nice little obstacle course and get the baby black ducklings to go through it and come to us. We get them warm and quack at them until they're imprinted to us. And then we quickly take them out to the field, and we live in tents. And every day you would weigh and measure your little ducklings and spend the whole day on the water in a boat, quacking at them and observing them to try to keep them imprinted to you. And we would do that, with shifts coming on and off, but we would do that for a few weeks for each pond. So it was quite an experience seeing your black ducklings learn to catch insects, learn how harsh Mother Nature is on them.
Let's just skip
grow.
to the point though. Can you quack like a duck for me?
I think I've lost that skill. So,
okay. All right. Well, with that, so Dr. Smith also has some wildlife background, but we also have joining us Dr. Nathan Webb, who is the director of the Wildlife Division for the Maine Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. He's a dual citizen, so half Canadian. Is that how we'd put that? Or
that's right. Yeah, born in the U.S., but spent quite a bit of time in Canada. So,
and you spent time up in Canada working with large mammals?
That's right. He actually went out there for graduate school after graduating from the wildlife program at UMaine, which is a great program. Worked on wolves and elk just east of Banff and Jasper National Parks, and then a little bit later on worked on grizzly bears, mountain lions, and all kinds of neat critters. So pretty great experience.
Oh yeah, sounds nice, and we won't hold it against you that you have a dual citizenship. But
I appreciate that.
The Canadians I don't know. I've heard they're a little more touchy to that kind of thing. So, and then these are my words, but you're trying to be somewhat of a homesteader. You've got kind of your own little mini farm going on.
Yeah, we try. We're not that successful, but yeah, we raise our own chickens and usually a few pigs every year, have a big garden, tap maple trees. So kind of live in the rural Maine lifestyle.
So that's, it looks like we lost Dr. Smith. So we might have to rely on you for the entire show there, Nathan. So, but anyway, that leads me to our fourth guest, Mike Abbott, who's been on the show. I think he was actually on the first 2 episodes for us. And Mike's a huge connection for me. He works at the CDC, and he's the one who brought Dr. Shaw to the show earlier on. And he's the one who lined up Dr. Smith for today. And he's also a hunter and a friend of mine. And he's even a pretty decent singer. Anything else that we should cover, Mike, or anything I should do to embarrass you?
We don't have time to list all my talents, Rob, so you can.
Okay. So Mike's here to serve as co-host and fill in for the blanks. And if we have technical difficulties like losing our guest, then he's here to fill in. So real quick.
Rob, I just heard from Dr. Smith that his computer crashed, but he is getting back on. He'll be right back.
Okay. Well, we'll bring him in just a minute. I think he'll have to miss this part, but let's have the discussion. Toilet paper, over or under? So Tim, why don't you give me your shot, your ideas?
It's got to be over, Rob. I shared with you. Hey, look at that. Shared with you a meme I found there. Beards are good, mullets are bad. I mean, that's great life advice. Toilet paper or haircuts.
Okay. All right. So, and Mike, you're in that same camp with Tim, I believe, right?
Yeah, nothing against mullets, but right, should be over.
Yeah. I'm the mullets rocked. I mean, I think we should bring that back. And I'm not a huge fan of the beards, although the goatee's okay, Mike. I'll give you credit for that. And the color mix looks great. What are your thoughts, Dr. Webb?
Oh, definitely over. In fact, I have to change it. I can't look at it. It's got to be changed. It has to be over.
Okay. We find it. I used to be an under guy, but the more I've started dealing with the over, the easier I found it's definitely a lot easier to grab. So I'll give you that. And then I did just come across, I don't know, I managed to find the picture, but here's the Timmy's tummy warmer out in was it Jackson Hole, Tim?
Yeah, that was from Nick Wilson's, which is a bar right at the bottom of the gondola.
Excellent.
They were missing butter shots on that, though. I don't know if it made it in the drink and off the table tent card, or they forgot about it altogether. But
so you are famous. You're probably the most famous of all of us on this show, then. So thanks again, everyone, for joining me, and let's get into the meat of the show here. And basically, November 23rd, I think the day was. I remember getting the email from IFW that basically don't eat the deer in the Fairfield area. Fortunately for myself, that's not the area that I hunt, so I wasn't too concerned, but I wasn't surprised that this was coming, having worked in the water industry for a while and known about beneficial reuse of sludge and so forth and spreading, but I wasn't aware of the hot spot. So Dr. Webb, you think you could tell me a little bit about how this came about? Like, how did we know PFAS was in that area? And then what was the timing that led up to when this advisory was issued?
Sure, I'll do my best. So probably most listeners are relatively aware of the contamination in some of the farm fields in the Fairfield area related to the spreading of sludge going all the way back to the 70s. And so we've been in pretty close contact with Maine DEP and Maine CDC, as well as Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry on that issue in that area for a number of months. Over the course of the summer and early fall, we started asking some questions to ourselves and looking into the potential for contamination in wildlife in that area that may have been foraging in some of those fields that were contaminated. We also heard from a few hunters that live in the area that had similar questions. So last fall, prior to the firearm season on deer, we actually sampled, I believe it was 8 deer right in the Fairfield area from some of the contaminated fields. And unfortunately, it took quite a while, and it took longer than we had expected to get those results back from the lab that we sent the samples to. When the results came back, it was very clear after some conversations with Dr. Smith and others that the PFAS levels in both the liver and the meat from those animals were at a level that they were not safe for human consumption. And so we very quickly, in the matter of a couple of days, put together the advisory and started communicating that message out to hunters. Unfortunately, it was really right in the middle of the firearm season on deer, which is sort of the peak time in the fall for deer hunting. So the timing was poor, but we felt we had an obligation to communicate that information as soon as we had it. I think for us at IF&W, there was probably a 2 or 3 day period where we received more phone calls, emails, Facebook messages on that issue than we have on any other issue in our history. It really grabbed the public's attention in a pretty substantial way.
Yeah, I mean, here's the SAM news. Well, it's not gonna come in good with my virtual background, but contaminated deer meat. I mean, this goes out, was there roughly 100,000 hunters in the state? I don't know the exact numbers, maybe.
Yeah, closer to 200,000.
200,000. So yeah, and of course, like I said, not all of us hunt in that area, but it certainly grabs our attention and starts thinking, okay, what about Bodenham? And I hunt on this field near some cornfields in Durham. Is that going to be a hot spot? Let me ask you though, you said that it was found in the liver and the meat. Are there any parts of the deer that would be safe to eat? It's the back straps, for instance. Like everybody likes the back straps.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I turn it over to probably to Andy for that. I mean, we sampled the liver knowing that that is where sort of contamination tends to accumulate in the body. So we weren't necessarily that surprised to find elevated PFAS levels in the liver, but and we do have liver consumption advisories related to cadmium in both moose and deer. So that's not really a new issue and wouldn't have been a surprise, I don't think, for us or the hunting community, but contamination of the meat was obviously of more concern.
Okay. Hey, Andy, welcome back to the show. Glad you were able to get right back in here. So
Yeah, it's good to have 2 computers in your office. So
yeah.
I could jump to the other one when the other one crashed. I think to follow up on Nathan's point, we don't know as much about deer, but we do know something about studies with cows. And so, for example, if you look at beef cattle and the sort of distribution of PFAS in the various tissues, you really see pretty much the same regardless of the cut. There aren't big differences. Back fat can be a little bit higher, but not that much higher than what you would see in the other tissues. So I think it's reasonable to assume that muscle fat are going to be fairly similar. The liver, as Nathan pointed out, is clearly much higher, and that's been seen in studies of deer in other states. Wisconsin, New Hampshire, and Michigan have both published similar findings on that.
So actually, this was a question that just came up. So do you know of other do not eat advisories in other states for deer related to this, or is this kind of a one in a nation, first in the nation kind of thing for us?
Certainly Michigan was the first one we were aware of, and that was sampling done around a Air Force base that had actually, in this case, it was surface water contamination in a swamp area. And they've done deer sampling there over the years. When they first did their advisory, it was a 5-mile radius based sort of like us on a small sample size. So they were conservative. And then over time, as they collected a lot more deer, they've been able to shrink it down. Nathan, I think it's 3 miles. Does that sound right? Right now, their advisory is down to about a 3-mile radius of this area.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So I actually had a question come in on the YouTube page, which was about the next topic on the script here is, does it matter? Do we know how the deer are getting contaminated? Like, is it from drinking contaminated water, or is it from eating certain crops, grass, corn, apples? Do we have any idea of that, or do we just know that it's deer in the area?
You
Yeah,
want
I
to
think
start,
that's
Nathan?
Yeah, I can start, and then you can take over, Andy. That's a great question. We don't know for sure. Again, the deer that we collected were foraging, or some of them were foraging in the fields that were contaminated. That seems like a likely route of transmission or accumulation of these toxins, but there could be other pathways as well. So with limited information, we've had to make some assumptions. We do intend and plan to do additional sampling to gather more information.
If you take it from a strictly empirical point of view, so we have 8 deer that we have data on. 5 of those deer were in a localized area around the Ohio Hill Road. And those were the deer that all had the highest levels in their meat and in their livers. And they also happened to be co-located with the fields that had the highest levels of PFAS and other PFAS in them. But they also happened to be fields with a couple of surface water ponds or impoundments, sort of a typical sort of farm pond on them, that also had fairly high levels of PFAS in the surface waters. So we're really not able to say, what the contribution of each of those to the exposure. The other variable we have is there are fairly different habitats. So if you look at and Nathan's the deer expert here, but I'll get myself in trouble as a toxicologist. There's, if you look at the Ohio Hill Road, you have fields that have been left fallow. There's much more mixed vegetation for plants and weeds and other things that may be of interest to the deer. Some of the other fields 2 miles away where the levels were 10 times lower, those were mostly cornfields. So that's a different habitat for deer to interact with. And then another came from a field where it was corn, but was left fallow for the year. And then also basically, I think that was shot behind a house on lawn. So we've got all these variables, different habitat for the deer, different types of vegetation, surface water, yes, surface water, not as much of an issue in others. And we're just not at this position right now where we can really point to a source or the relative importance of different sources. Did I leave anything out there, Nathan? So
no, that covers it well. Thanks, Andy.
Well, that's I'm going to move on to a little bit about what determines the safe and unsafe levels and health effects. And Tim, I'm going to ask you to chime in here and share a little bit about your personal story. I mean, we talked earlier and you've harvested some deer in the area. You've lived in the advisory area. Can you tell us a little bit about that and share your experience?
Sure. Yeah. From 2011 to 2019, I lived right on the Fairfield Norwalk town line, which is, sorry, lights went off, a few miles away from kind of the epicenter, but certainly well within the advisory area and even near some other sites that were permitted and included in a study for PFAS levels. So in the time I was there, I hunted and harvested 4 deer from the advisory area. And another big concern of mine is multiple ducks that were shot directly down gradient from the epicenter field. There's a small stream, fish stream or fish brook that runs on the down gradient side of all these fields where they were spread. And lo and behold, back 7, 8, 9 years ago, before we knew any of this, that was one of the best duck hunting areas I had found in the area, and was quite successful and had harvested numerous ducks as well as those 4 deer. Fed them to my children and ate them myself, and thought that this is the best food you can get. It's all natural. It's from this area. So the whole phosphorus cycle and it all just, it's what we're supposed to do. Growing our own vegetables right on the property, much like Nate. And I'm down gradient along Lost Brook from one of those sites, and our well water could certainly have been influenced, and we're pumping water up out of that well to feed the plants during the dry parts of the summer. And so I had a lot of questions come up as I started to research the dozens and dozens of bills that popped up over the last session regarding PFAS. And certainly when that advisory came out last November, the questions just multiplied in my head, like, holy moly, what have I gotten myself into here? What have I been feeding my children, myself? And were there any impacts on any of our health over the last several years that may or may not have had something to do with the way that we were living our lives?
Is hair loss one of the symptoms?
I think that's more genetic, Rob, but hey, not all of us can be as pretty as a talk show host like you.
Hey, buddy, look, there's definitely some spots that have been there for a long time. Okay. So, and I'm sure I've had my PFAS exposure as well, just, from various things in the Brunswick area. So, yeah, can we talk, I think Andy, I think you have can discuss a little bit about the health effects. What are we looking at for issues?
Well, let's start with how we know about the health effects for these chemicals, and this big family of chemicals. And then I'll talk a little bit about what the health effects associated with them. And then if you want, Rob, I'll continue and talk about how we use that to try to come up with how much is too much in deer meat or any other sort of food, milk, beef that we're currently dealing with as well.
Yeah, give me the Cliff Notes version. Someone on my
Notes
level
version. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start with how we know about the relationship between these chemicals and health effects. And most of what we're learning about now are coming from health studies of communities that unfortunately have contaminated wells, often public water supplies. So there's an area in near the West Virginia-Ohio border. Any of you have seen the movie Dark Waters. It's sort of featured for that area. And so they had wells that became contaminated from leaching from a manufacturing facility for those. And the wells were quite high in concentrations. And therefore the exposures were quite high. And they got like a $70 million settlement to do a health study and empowered a panel of scientists to come in and direct it and manage it. And those results have now been published. And then there have been similar studies done elsewhere. There's a place in Sweden called Ronberg that also has very high levels in its waters. And there are papers being published looking again at health studies of those populations. And more of those are coming out all the time from these types of studies of humans. And the sort of health effects that are being reported are things like that are associated with the higher your exposure, the higher the risk of this is increased cholesterol levels, increased changes in liver enzymes, possibly liver damage, decreased, right there, you've got it from a talk I've done. These are sort of the major ones where there's a consensus. You see these in a number of studies, but increased cholesterol levels, decreased vaccine response, that's measured by looking at levels of antibodies after you get a vaccine and seeing a dose-dependent decrease. Changes in liver enzymes, although it's not clear that that means an increased risk of liver disease. Increased risk of high blood pressure or a more serious complication during pregnancy called preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure plus effects on other organs like the kidney and liver. Possibly small decreases in infant birth weight. And then the one that's getting a lot of attention now is this increased risk of kidney cancer and testicular cancer. Those are the ones that we seem to know most about. And then you can take these sort of health effects and try from looking at the levels of exposure to determine what's called a potency. This is a a relationship just that gives you information about how to relate an exposure to a health risk. And then we use that to determine like how much is too much in deer meat, or how much is too much in milk, or how much is too much in beef, or how much is too much in fish. And the approach for doing that is pretty simple. You have what's called this toxicity value or a potency estimate, which is specific to the PFAS you're looking at, whether it's PFAS or PFOA or some of these other ones. And then you have a consumption rate. So how much of it you eat, it's standard practice to model based on a high-end consumption, like the 90th percentile consumption rate. And you use those two to get an action level. And if you're above the action level, you've got concerns, you might issue an advisory. If you're below, you don't. In the case of the deer advisory, what we did is we actually computed how many meals per month you could eat, given the various levels we measured in deer meat and deer liver. And as Nathan pointed out, when we did that computation and found out for the highest deer, you could only eat 1 or 2 or 3 meals a year. That was the reason for the do not eat advisory.
So someone that had their back straps and really, really wanted to eat those could probably get away with it, but throw the rest of it out, huh?
Well, you're gonna have to educate me as to what the back straps are.
That's just the best chunk of meat that comes out along the spine there, and it's prime. Let's just put it that way. So,
well, if you're in the advisory area, the recommendation would be that you don't eat
all right,
any of the deer meat from those.
I'm trying to stretch it a little bit, but okay. Well, that's excellent, and we have some questions coming in on the YouTube feed, and I'm going to get to those in a second, but I do need to take another just a minute or two to thank our sponsors and do another sponsor break. So again, this episode is sponsored by Thai Sales. They provide high quality, long-term water and wastewater solutions to customers all across New England and New York, all with the vision of helping you deliver and accurately measure safe, clean, high-quality drinking water to every home and business in your area. The last 2 years have been difficult, with both health and safety challenges and supply chain bottlenecks adding all sorts of complications to daily life. Through it all, Thai Sales is here to help make your life easier with famously fast service. Almost all orders are shipped the same day they're received, and they maintain high inventory levels to anticipate your needs. From waterworks, brass tools, and service materials to meters and metering systems, if you need it, Thai Sales almost certainly has it, as well as the expert technical support you need to get your solution up and running in no time. So if you're looking to overcome a water distribution or treatment challenge, locate a hard to find product, or just understand what your options are, Thai Sales can help. Reach them at 1-800-225-4616 or on the web at thaisales.com. That's TISales.com. So there. And again, we're very thankful to have them, because none of this would happen. And thank you to all of you for coming on today. I know it's hard to find time, and everybody's in this crazy work climate that we're working in, and extremely busy. And like Nate said, probably the most amount of phone calls they've ever received at IFW, this past year. And so it just seems like it's one thing on top of another. So thank you so much for coming out today and supporting the program and sharing your knowledge. So one of the questions that came in, and we discussed this a little bit yesterday, was we know that the PFAS is persistent in the environment. We know the Fairfield area. We know where the contamination came from. So how long can we expect this advisory to be in place? And Nate, can you talk to us a little bit about that? And then maybe Andy can chime in on the half-life side of it.
Sure. No, that's a great question. It's really important to point out that we issued that advisory, based on the best information we had at the time, but it really was quite limited, really a small number of deer from a very limited geographic area. We are currently developing a plan for a much more comprehensive sampling program that would expand sort of the geographic scope of the sampling in the Fairfield area to hopefully further refine the advisory and ideally narrow it down to a smaller radius. And like Andy mentioned earlier, that approach has been how things have played out in other states that have faced similar issues, but also to look at the potential for contamination in other species, whether that be turkey or waterfowl or small game. So our hope is that we can, through more intensive sampling over the next 6 months or so, refine the area based on more information. And our hope is that the advisory will be reduced in size, but we don't know yet whether that will be the case. We'll really have to collect more information and sample additional deer to figure out if that's appropriate or not.
Okay, and then so let's just say we contaminate or put up an 8-foot high fence around this contaminated fields that we know about, and we're able to get the wildlife, get PFAS out of the food source and water source of the wildlife in the area. How long would it take for a generation or deer for us to see the levels actually decrease?
So that's I think a great question for Andy.
Okay, thank you. Yes, he's the half-life expert.
Absolutely.
Right. And when Rob's mentioning half-life, what he's referring to is it's a kinetic measure, we call it, but it's basically if you had a way to stop exposure for the animals or greatly reduce it, how long would it take for the level of these chemicals in the meat to decrease by 1/2? And that's measured as a length of time. And that length of time is called the half-life. So we don't have half-life estimates for PFAS in deer, but we do for beef cattle and dairy cattle. And for the muscle tissue, it's on the order of 2 to 3 months. So if you were able to, and it's probably going to be something similar for deer. So if you were able to greatly reduce or stop exposure, and let's say your levels at 40, in 2 or 3 months, it would be down to 20. Another 2 or 3 months, it would be down to 10. Another 2 to 3 months down to 5, another 2 to 3 months down to 2.5. And eventually you'd start to get down to levels where there wouldn't be a need for an advisory. The tricky part is we don't really understand yet which are the most important pathways. So even if we can fence the fields, the question that Tim brought up yesterday is, well, what about surface waters? And so that's just something we'll have to try to understand and see how that works. And if turkeys turn to be out an issue for us, I'm not sure, Nathan, that a fence is going to work for turkeys necessarily. But that's, again, these are all unknowns. And until we collect more data, it's really hard for us to know. But the good news is that if you can find a way to intercept, if you will, the major sources of exposure, the levels will decrease over time in the body of animals.
Okay. So that you guys do a great job basically hosting the show yourselves, because we go right from one topic to another without me having to do much. So you kind of segued into turkeys. And what about other game? I know most, the advisory is related to deer. I got a feeling most people that hunt in that area are not going to eat turkeys this year either, just, in our mind. And do you anticipate an advisory coming for something like that? Or do we have any idea, if deer are contaminated, can we extrapolate out that you shouldn't be eating partridge or squirrels or turkeys in the area either?
Right. No, that's a great question. The short answer is we don't know which other species may be impacted. And as Andy described, not really being confident in the pathway, it's hard to make any sort of firm assumptions about what other species might be exposed. However, we do intend to sample other species that are commonly hunted. The first of those will be turkey, given that the spring hunting season for turkey is coming right up here, essentially in the month of May. So we do intend to collect samples from turkey over the next month or two, with the goal of informing whether or not an advisory is warranted for turkeys in advance of the upcoming spring hunting season for turkey, in the hopes that hunters will be able to plan ahead and decide whether or not to hunt in that area before the season starts.
So how
I
does
think-
the testing work? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Andy.
Well, I was just going to add to that. One thing Nate and I were looking at recently was a kind of a review publication about what we know of PFAS and wildlife. And one of the things that caught both of our eyes was, and maybe Nate, you can remember, there aren't data on turkey, but I think it was quail and mallards in it. And they have actually quite short half-lives of these chemicals in their bodies. So that's just another factor to think about is there's going to be difference between species and how fast these chemicals are eliminated. And so even though they may have the opportunity for exposure, things just may play out differently because of differences in how the chemicals are cycled through their bodies as compared to deer, as compared to us.
So you mentioned getting rid of the chemicals. I think people use the term forever chemicals with PFAS and PFOA and all the different versions. Are we going to be able to clean these chemicals up and fix these contaminated sites?
Oh, that's a great question for our DEP colleagues.
Okay.
You know, when you think of the hundreds of acres and the contaminated soils, removing it, you know, just may prove to be cost prohibitive. So, you know, the interesting areas for research might be whether there are things that can be added to the soil to make them less mobile, you know, and less able to be taken up by plants. But we'll just have to, you know, see that's an area of research, and we can hope that methods like that will come to the fore and be available to use. But at present, it doesn't look like there's any good way to, you know, clean this up, if you will.
Okay. Tim, did you want to, I saw you unmute yourself. Did you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, through legislation over the last year and a half or so, there's a lot of new laws that should help with the source, the PFAS themselves, including, outlawing any unnecessary uses of PFAS, trying to eliminate AFFF from all of the fire departments, and coming up with some funding for the DEP, albeit on the backs of the wastewater treatment plants, but some funding for, testing additional sites and looking at remediation options. So while there's not a clear answer as to when, the how is certainly kind of playing out right now.
Okay. And you kind of mentioned more testing and finding new, identifying other sites. Are there any other sites that are currently on like a watch list or an advisory area, or are there areas of concern that have been identified either through IFW or CDC or what? I don't know if Nate, are you the one to address that one?
I can try. I mean, Andy's very well versed in this as well. There certainly are other locations in the state where this material has been spread, and DEP is embarking and underway with a broader testing program at other locations. Speaking specifically to impacts on wildlife, we will be sort of following DEP as they implement sampling of both soil and water in other locations. We will be sampling wildlife as well to determine whether advisories may be necessary in other locations.
So the two organizations will basically work together, collaborate, and test soils and test animals in the same area.
Absolutely, and this really is it's a multi-agency effort. DEP certainly is sort of taking the lead on the soil and water sampling, but CDC is obviously very involved. Our agency is, and agriculture, conservation, and forestry is heavily engaged as well. So this is it's a pretty big issue and a pretty important one for the state of Maine and for state government overall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rob, this might be a good time to mention that, all these sites were originally permitted sites. So that's kind of where the starting point is for testing. You go to the fields where they were permitted to spread the sludge, and DEP is kind of using that information and the amount that was spread and the dates that it was spread to come up with a basis for where to start their testing, how to prioritize it, and how to move on from there.
Yeah, I mean, we have plenty of records. We know at least where it was legally spread for the last, 30, 40 years. And so it should be pretty easy to identify what may be a possible hotspot. So did you have something to add to that, Andy?
No, Tim just covered it was
Okay.
the point that
Okay.
the DEP folks do have a plan for a tiered plan for sampling sites based on volume of material that was land applied, the likelihood that that material included PFAS in them or may have been contaminated with PFAS, and then proximity of private wells to the area. So they sort of used all that to come up with tier 1, 2, and 3, and it's all information on their website that you can see to understand what their plans are.
Okay. I do want to just circle back earlier. Nate, you had talked about doing more testing with the wildlife and so forth with like turkeys this spring. How does that work? Do you have biologists just hang out at tagging stations, or do people voluntarily bring game in? Like, how do you determine that?
That's a great question. So to this point, the 8 deer that we sampled, we actually we collected those. So we killed those animals. And Andy can speak more to this, but the sampling protocol is extremely strict. There's a high risk of contamination. We're sampling for these chemicals at the level of parts per million or parts per billion. So we really need to follow very strict protocols to ensure that the samples are viable, and the testing is extremely expensive. So it's not really a situation where we can collect thousands of samples, which we could do theoretically from tagging stations from hunter-killed animals, but the testing itself would be cost prohibitive using that approach. So to this point, and our immediate plans are to use animals that we collect and sample ourselves or through some contract staff that we use for this sort of work. There may be the potential in the future to use hunter harvested animals to contribute to the sampling plan, but at least our initial focus is we'll be using animals and samples that we collect ourselves.
Okay.
Nate brings up a great point that really highlights how prevalent these products are in our society today. The testing requirements, I mean, you basically have to not have taken a shower for the last 3 weeks and have a hazmat suit on, because so many of your personal care products, your outer layers that you wear, contain PFAS, and if any of that cross contaminates with your sample, then you have an erroneous sample.
So not showering for 3 weeks. So Tim, are you doing the sampling?
Yeah, I'm about 2 weeks into a sample right now. So.
Yeah, good. Good. Thanks for opening the door on that one. We do have an interesting question. I do. Somebody on the YouTube wants to make sure that the big bucks in Willimantic are still okay to hunt and harvest. Although I don't think you'll ever get one, but are they okay?
So, at this point, the only information we have is really limited to Fairfield. We know there's a concern there. We don't have any information on PFAS levels in deer anywhere else in the state.
Okay.
So I know it's kind of a evasive answer, and I apologize for that. But we can only, share what we know, and what we know at this point is that there is a concern in the Fairfield area, and we will be doing further testing in other locations.
Someone I know, used to say, what you don't know can't hurt you, right? So shoot that baby. Keep on hunting up in Willimantic. But we obviously know that that's not true. And then someone else brought up a question, and instead of looking at remediation, is there any type of like natural way to remove PFAS, like with a certain vegetation planted or is there a way to break it down some way so that it's not like this expensive removal process? Can anybody address that one?
I can take a stab at just what we've, been made aware of in meetings. And, you may have seen the article in the Bangor Daily News recently about the idea of possibly using hemp as, which has a, bit of literature and history of being used to help remove metals from soil. So the question is whether that may also be able to be used for PFAS. We'll see how that plays out. We do have to remember that these are fields that we're currently working on that have been growing crops for decades, right? And we still have plenty in the soil. So any process like that will likely be slow, I would assume, but that's just an assumption on my part. There are people that are interested in looking at adding various sort of high carbon products to soil to see if instead of pulling it out, you can just make it immobile, both for going to groundwater as well as going up into plants. So I think we'll see more of that being tested in the future as well.
Well, it's good to know that there's some, options at least being explored. We don't know how successful that'll be, but hopefully we'll come up with something. That's for sure.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize, I mean, this is an international issue. So there's a lot of science that's coming out almost daily from both the health side, both the environmental fate side, but also people looking at options for mitigation as well. So I think we'll see a real explosion of information over the, the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do just one last sponsor break here, and then we'll come back. This is only going to take a few seconds here, but again, I do need to thank Thai Sales. They're a leading distributor of water and wastewater supplies across all of New England and New York. They're dedicated to having the fastest service and the most knowledgeable experts in the industry. Since 1963, Thai Sales has worked with countless water utilities, contractors, consultants, and resellers to provide the highest quality products and solutions to meet their long-term needs. And again, you can reach them at 1-800-225-4616 or on the web at thaisales.com. And that's the letter T, the letter I, and the word sales.com. And, again, from myself personally, I know they're a huge sponsor of many events that Maine Water Utilities and Maine Water Environment put on. And I know they're a great resource for a lot of us in the industry. So, and without them, we wouldn't have had this show today. So thanks again to Thai Sales. So we got about 5 minutes left in the broadcast, and I want to just kind of turn it over. Is there anything that each of you want to, while you've got the screen time, is there anything that we haven't covered that someone may want to put out there as a message to the public or anything like that? And I'll start with Tim and go ahead and weigh in.
Well, I'm just super curious if your butcher is taking those inner loins, because you keep referring to the back strap as the best cut of meat on a deer.
Yeah, well, the tenderloins are pretty good, but they I was going to kind of keep that as a little bit of a secret, but I prefer the back straps because there's enough to feed the whole family usually. So those inner loins are only a bite and then they're gone, and it's kind of sad, but yes.
Rob, I wanted to take the opportunity to congratulate you on your recent promotion. And I think this is your first episode as the general manager of Brunswick Sewer District.
Well, yeah, thank you. It's been a fun couple of weeks, so busy.
Beyond that, I would say, there's still a very active legislature regarding PFAS. There's at least 3 new printed bills this year. So, certainly something to keep an eye on. And if you're affected in any way, pay attention to the bills that are being printed and certainly speak up if you feel like you have something to add, to that conversation. We've testified as Maine and Maine Water Environment Association on closing in on probably close to 20 bills. I've got over a dozen listed down here that I just drummed up real quick before the session started. Most importantly, I would say that there's been a new MCL set as of last year for PFAS in drinking water. We've been able to outlaw some of the supply over the next 10 to 12 years, which should help with, the reoccurring issue. And I mentioned, some of the funding on the backs of the wastewater treatment plants. Look for your wastewater bills to maybe creep up a little bit over the next few years, because we are paying a lot of money to dispose of our biosolids at this point.
Yeah, we're looking at just at least $20,000 in added cost for Brunswick alone, and we're just one of the many districts in the state. And I mean, it's a good effort. We want to clean this up and learn more about it for sure. But it's too bad that it does fall on the backs of our customers. But we're all in this together. We all contribute to the issues. So every time we flush our toilet, I guess. Good. Well, thanks, Tim. Andy, anything that you want to throw a plug in for, or anything that we didn't cover that you think is important to let the audience know?
The only thing I would add is the point I made before. This is just an area of an incredible emerging amount of science and new information. We completely understand that people may be frustrated. We don't have all the answers now. They're wondering what to do with deer meat in their freezer, but we completely get that. But I think, as Nate has said, all we have is the information we have right now. We're working on accumulating more, and stay tuned as we collect more information and hopefully answer some of the questions that we're being asked on a regular basis.
So is it's fair to say that the science is not settled in this case?
No, it's far from it,
Okay.
from and on all aspects, whether we're talking about the toxicity of the chemicals, which all indications are the more we learn, the more concerned we get about them, whether it's about their persistence in the environment, whether it's about plant uptake into different parts of plants, variation between the PFAS chemicals, differences between wildlife, pretty much every area you can think about is emerging science with new papers coming out weekly.
Okay. And Nate, you got some closing remarks or want to throw a plug in there from IFW's point of view?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would really reiterate what Andy said. We deal with a lot of issues and, in our agency related to wildlife. And this is one that, I'll be honest, that, it kind of caught us off guard. And there's very few issues that we deal with that we don't have sort of previous expertise in-house or in Maine, or where we can't look to our colleagues across the country or even elsewhere in the world for advice and guidance. And this has been a situation where, we have felt really, sort of out of our element and really kind of on thin ice a little bit, so to speak, because there's just so little known about the relationship between PFAS and wildlife. And I think Andy had mentioned earlier a review paper focused on PFAS and wildlife, and it's amazing how little is known and how little research has been done. So I would just ask for a bit of patience on the part of our constituents and our stakeholders. Our staff are very engaged on this issue. They're committed to collecting more information and providing the best possible guidance and advice to hunters. But this really is an emerging issue, and there'll be a lot more to come from us in the coming months.
Well, I appreciate all of you coming on the show today. And as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a topic that really hits home for me as a hunter, and I try to feed my family off wild game as much as possible. And so it's certainly concerning, but it's nice to know that there's a lot of really, really smart, intelligent people working on this, and that we've put some funds aside to address this. And thank you for updating us. We had some more comments on the YouTube page, but they were all just thank you, great perspective, very well done. So you were all fantastic guests, made a great show. If we can do a follow-up on this in 6 months or a year or so, would you be willing to come back and put, of course, I like to put you on the spot. Who can say no while we're still live? So, but I'll certainly be reaching out, and I know you've got a ton of work ahead of you, and thank you for your efforts outside this show as well. Very important jobs, very important to the people of Maine. So, and those of us in the water industry, and even Tim, who's heavily involved for in the legislative process, and he's going to be leading the WIA next year. So, so we're in some good hands, and I appreciate it. And I did. Hey, Nate, we went to we were at college at the same time. You can't see because of the virtual background, but I found my old wildlife ecology book from college when I was cleaning out my office the other day. So
Yeah, I recognize that I have the same book.
yeah, it's the only book I kept from college. So and I did engineering. So so that tells you how important it is to me. So okay, well, with that, we'll go ahead and log off, and thank you everyone for listening.